When the Vietnam War ended with the evacuation of the last military personnel in Saigon on April 30th, 1975, it ended 10 years of direct military involvement. But another incident would occur almost immediately afterward that would once again bring U.S. forces into conflict with a new communist aggressor and at great cost in military lives. The capture of the SS Mayaguez and her crew by the Khmer Rouge, the new ruling communist regime in Cambodia under Pol Pot, became the final crisis involving the United States in the Vietnam War. What was the Mayaguez Incident? Why and how was the ship and crew captured? What was the American rescue plan? What actually happened? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. At the time, the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, had recently taken control of Cambodia and were highly distrustful of the U.S. The capture of the ship on May 12, 1975, was seen as an act of hostility toward the United States, prompting a swift American military response. The Mayaguez, a U.S.-flagged merchant vessel owned by the Sea-Land Corporation, was en route from Hong Kong to Thailand when it entered waters near Cambodia's Koh Tang Island. A Khmer Rouge gunboat, commanded by troops loyal to Pol Pot, approached the Mayaguez and forcibly boarded it. The ship's captain, Charles T. Miller, and his crew of 39 were taken hostage. Miller had sent a message relating the ongoing event before capture. The Khmer Rouge forced the crew to sail toward Koh Tang Island, a small island off Cambodia's coast. On May 13, 1975, the U.S. government reacted and started putting together a hasty plan. Captain Charles T. Miller and his crew were first taken to Koh Tang Island, but later moved to a Thai fishing trawler, where they were held offshore. It is unclear whether the Khmer Rouge ever intended to harm the crew. Some reports suggest that they were unsure how to respond to the growing U.S. military presence, and they may have sought to de-escalate the situation. In fact, Pol Pot may have never even authorized it. President Gerald Ford viewed the seizure as an act of piracy and demanded the immediate release of the crew, and he ordered the aircraft carrier USS Coral Sea and the destroyer USS Harold E. Holt and several other ships into the area. The U.S. attempted diplomatic efforts through China, which had ties with Cambodia, but those failed and no resolution was achieved. The U.S. then decided to use military force to rescue the Mayaguez and its crew. On May 14, 1975, U.S. intelligence believed that the crew was being held on Koh Tang Island, and a rescue operation was planned involving the U.S. Marines and Air Force helicopters. The plan included a direct assault on Koh Tang, a boarding of the Mayaguez, and an airstrike against Cambodian naval forces. This would result in the Battle of Koh Tang on May 15, 1975. The attack on Koh Tang was led by U.S. Marines from the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, supported by Air Force CH-53 helicopters. At dawn, Marines began their assault and were met with unexpectedly fierce resistance from the well-armed and well-entrenched Khmer Rouge forces. The island was heavily fortified, with machine gun nests and bunkers, leading to a disastrous landing for the first wave of Marines. Several helicopters were shot down or damaged, and Marines were trapped on the beach under intense fire. Meanwhile, the USS Harold E. Holt successfully boarded the Mayaguez and found it empty. The crew had already been transferred to another location. Unbeknownst to the U.S., Khmer Rouge had moved the crew to a fishing boat, which was later spotted heading toward the Cambodian mainland. The U.S. Navy ships and aircraft carriers moving aggressively into the area and military action being imminent, the Khmer Rouge leadership in Phnom Penh likely decided that holding the Americans was not worth the risk of full-scale U.S. retaliation. As a result, the Thai fishing vessel carrying the crew was intercepted without incident, and the 39 crew members were released unharmed on May 15, 1975. But their liberation was unrelated to the U.S. military assault on Koh Tang Island. But the difficulties were not over, because even with the crew safe and the Mayaguez secured, the focus shifted to extracting the Marines still stranded on Koh Tang. The American leadership in Washington and on the battlefield was initially unaware that the crew had been released, and the military assault on Koh Tang continued even though the crisis had effectively ended. Fighting on Koh Tang continued for several hours after the hostages were freed because U.S. military forces were unaware of their safe release. This resulted in unnecessary casualties, and Marines remained engaged with well-fortified Khmer Rouge forces. However, the evacuation was chaotic as Khmer Rouge forces continued to attack. By the time the U.S. began withdrawing its forces later that day, 3 Marines had been left behind on Koh Tang Island. This was a tragic oversight that led to their capture and eventual execution by the Khmer Rouge. They were Lance Corporal Joseph Hargrove, Private First Class Gary Hall, and Private Danny Marshall. Why did the Khmer Rouge release the hostages? Well, it was believed that the massive U.S. military, naval, and air response likely played a role in persuading the Khmer Rouge to let the crew go. I'm certain Pol Pot had a decision in that. The Khmer Rouge may have also wanted to avoid an escalation that could lead to a direct U.S. invasion of Cambodia, for which they were unprepared. Some analysts believe the Khmer Rouge never intended to keep the crew long-term, and that the seizure of the Mayaguez was meant as a symbolic show of force rather than an actual hostage crisis. Cambodia's estimated losses were 13 to 25 killed on Koh Tang proper, with an unknown number killed on swift boats and on the Cambodian mainland, numbering over 60 killed in action total. U.S. casualties were 10 Marines, 2 Navy corpsmen, and an Air Force crewman killed in the crash of Jolly Green, call sign Knife 31, an Air Force crewman killed in the crash of call sign Knife 21, 1 Marine killed in action on the West Beach, and 3 Marines missing in action and presumed dead. 50 were wounded, including 35 Marines and 6 airmen. In addition, 18 U.S. Air Force security police and 5 flight crew were killed in the CH-53 crash on the way to Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield, which was to be used as a staging area. Despite the end result, President Ford and the U.S. government declared the mission a success as the crew of the Mayaguez was safely recovered. However, the battle demonstrated poor intelligence and planning, leading to unnecessary American casualties, marking the last official military engagement of the Vietnam War era. It also proved the necessity of having a contingency plan for any and all situations. The surprise of the incident caught the U.S. government unprepared, resulting in a hastily planned mission. It underscored the aggressive stance the U.S. was willing to take against perceived acts of aggression, even as its military presence in Southeast Asia was ending. The Khmer Rouge, realizing the power of the U.S. military, avoided direct confrontations with the U.S. afterward. The fate of the 3 missing Marines was not fully confirmed until much later, adding controversy to how the withdrawal was handled. However, the cost of the operation made it one of the more controversial U.S. military actions of the post-Vietnam period. The lessons learned would be applied to future rescue operations, but it would be a slow learning process. 4 airmen were awarded the Air Force Cross for their actions during the battle. Captain Roland Purser, pilot of Jolly Green 43, First Lieutenant Donald Backlund, pilot of Jolly Green 11, First Lieutenant Richard C. Brims, pilot of call sign Knife 51, Staff Sergeant John Harston, flight mechanic of call sign Knife 51. Second Lieutenant James V. McDaniel, platoon commander of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, was awarded the Navy Cross. 2 airmen and 4 Marines were awarded the Silver Star. Technical Sergeant Wayne Fisk, a pararescue man on call sign Knife 51, First Lieutenant Bob Blau, pilot of Jolly Green 44, Lieutenant Colonel Randall W. Austin, the commanding officer of 2 9 Marines, First Lieutenant Michael S. Eustis, Marine Corps, Artillery Liaison Officer of 2 9 Marines, First Lieutenant James D. Keith, USMC, the Executive Officer of Company G, 2 9 Marines, First Lieutenant Terry L. Tonkin, USMC, the Forward Air Controller of 2 9 Marines. The Mayaguez incident is often compared to the later 1980 Iran hostage rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, due to its combination of poor planning, intelligence failures, and unexpected resistance. It remains a significant moment in U.S. military history, symbolizing both the end of the Vietnam War era and the unpredictable nature of military interventions. The names of the lost servicemen are commemorated on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, and Pol Pot would not suffer any political or further military consequences because of their actions. Pol Pot's genocidal reign of terror would come to an end when Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia in 1979, and please see our video on Pol Pot and his madness. Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.